Hello everybody and welcome to the fourth video in the Mental Architecture Building the Mind One Moment at a Time series. This video is going to talk about Chapter 2, Section 1, which is called The Mind's Clock. And so we're going to be shifting our attention away from the talk about empty space and silence and to talking about the perception of time and the influence that memory has on time and that time has on memory. I'd like to begin with a quote from poet T.S. Eliot that describes the nature of time as he saw it. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction remaining a perceptual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo, thus, in your mind. But to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves? I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? So when I see that quote, I just think about how sometimes I've done certain things and then wondered how my life would have turned out differently if I would have done something else. But unfortunately, you can never know because you chose the path you chose, and now all those other paths you could have possibly selected are no longer available to you. So you can never go back and relive that moment and choose something again. You're just stuck with whatever you have. So what is time? We're all familiar with it. We measure our lives by it, and yet it's kind of hard to define exactly what it is. We have units, seconds, hours, minutes, and so on like that to describe the passage of it, but where does the passage of time happen? And so in my book, in the Mind's Clock, I argue that the passage of time happens pretty much in your mind. So what you see here is the hypothalamus, and then if you look kind of in the middle, there's this little kidney-shaped object that's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN, and it sits just above the optic chiasm, the optic nerve, just slightly above that. And this is thought to be the location of where you get your sense of time. So circadian rhythms, for instance, which are basically the rhythm your brain uses in order for you to distinguish for you when it's morning, when it's night, are thought to be carried out here. And also your brain's responses to light. So when light's coming in, notice how close it is to the optic nerve. That's probably not an accident. So as you know, when you get up in the morning and it's bright out, it helps you wake up. And then when the sun goes down, you start to get tired. Melatonin is released to help make you tired and ready to go to bed. So in the 90s, researchers discovered that the SCN contained genes that were literally responsible for the oscillatory behavior of the SCN. So the LCN contains a bidirectional feedback loop where light and other sensory data comes in, is then processed in the hypothalamus, and this is where people get their sense of time from. And three of these genes are called the period or per gene, cryptochrome, and timeless. And the one that was studied the most is the period gene, and this was found that throughout all the cells in the SCN, they actually contained this gene, meaning that they all kind of acted like little clocks. So there isn't just one clock, but there's multiple clocks all throughout the SCN, all acting in different ways. Now the period gene is the most interesting one because it's the one that has the highest levels during the daytime when the light is out and the lowest levels at night when there isn't much light. And so researchers hypothesize that what happens is light enters through the eye and is processed by the retina, and then sensory data enters into the retinohypothalamic tract, or RHT, where it's processed and interpreted. So there you have a connection from data coming in from the outside world, be it light or other light-related stuff, and then you have processing happening in the brain. So this is where your brain forms the sense of time. Now, studies in mice show that damage to the RHT really messed up their entire circadian rhythm. In hamsters, lesions in a non-photoreceptive part of the retinohypothalamic tract actually completely damaged their circadian rhythm, even though the period genes were completely unaltered. So that's kind of interesting and shows you the importance of the RHT. Circadian rhythm stability in mammals is likely very location specific in the SCN and not necessarily predictable. So damage could happen all over, could have lesions in different parts of it, but only in certain parts will you see effects of the circadian rhythm. So without getting into too much detail, basically there's all these cells in the SCN that are all working together, some of them synchronously, and if damage happens to one of them, then it can affect things further on down the chain, kind of like a supply distribution for a warehouse. And what you end up with are some pretty significant consequences. So you have a whole like orchestra of rhythmic cells working together to provide the brain with a sense of time and to basically construct a stable circadian rhythm. One of the things that the SCN helps regulate is body temperature. As you know, a person's baseline body temperature averages around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and the body temperature tends to rise during the day and then fall at night, and it kind of behaves somewhat rhythmically. Now, the SCN is not the end-all be-all of time processes in the body, far from it. One of the most important time processes is your heartbeat. If you have too fast of a heartbeat, that can indicate that you might have hypertension or some underlying problem. Slower heartbeats are not necessarily a problem, but they can sometimes be one. Usually they mean that you may be of exceptional physical fitness. But irregular heartbeats are especially troublesome because those can be warning signs of an impending heart attack or stroke. So this is an example of a time process in your body that is absolutely critical to survival. Now, the perception of time is a whole nother story, much more complicated than like a simple physiological process. So the perception of time is a combination both of the events going on in your SCN and just some other psychological factors. So there's a lot at work when it comes to the way that you perceive time. If you've ever been bored, you know that time appears to go by very slowly. And if you've ever been really engaged in something that you wish would never end, it seems like time just goes by too fast. So what's going on there? One of the most popular theories about the way you perceive time is the pacemaker switch accumulator, or PSA. So what happens here is you have your visual stimulus or whatever entering through your brain, and then your pacemaker regulates it, and then it switches over to the accumulator, which is your long-term memory store in the hippocampus. And either your brain accepts it or rejects it, and if your brain accepts it, it becomes part of your perception of that moment in time. So basically, depending on how many events occur in a given interval that are going to be stored in your memory are what is going to determine how you perceive that time to pass. Now, the pacemaker switch accumulator model can only account for so much as far as your perception of time. There are so many other factors that can influence how you perceive it. So I'd like to do a simple experiment with you. I'm going to ask you to look at the second hand of a moving clock. Yeah, I know, not the most exciting thing, but just play along. So what you might have noticed is that it seems like it takes longer for the second hand on a clock to move from 1 second to the next than it actually does. And no matter how much you stare at it, you just can't get that out of your head. Well, there's a physiological reason for that. The phenomenon is actually known as chronostasis. And the reason why it occurs is your saccadic eye movements are actually not in sync with the second hand of the clock. So this is a trick your brain plays on you to make a second seem longer than it actually is. Kind of crazy. So thank you for joining me for another one of my mental architecture videos. We'll be back next week with another video on past, present, and future. Be sure to like and subscribe down here and leave any comments for me that you'd like, and I'll get back to those. Thank you again, and I hope everybody has a great day.